everyone. Welcome to Cyber Judo. I'm Christian Scott, our host, and I am joined by my fantastic co-host and brother, Shane Scott. Tonight, we're going to be talking a little bit about generative AI, specifically around Microsoft Copilot and what type of security, governance, and compliance risks organizations should be aware of as they go to roll out Copilot across their organization. We're also in that process going to talk just a little bit about how threat actors have been leveraging Microsoft Copilot, as well as other generative AI solutions deployed across the enterprise for living off the land attacks. As we jump into it, we'll talk a little bit about how to correctly, securely deploy Copilot and roll it out to an organization with good considerations in mind with, data sensitivity and labeling and setting up, mechanisms to detect insider risks, right? That's really, really important. And then lastly, we'll wrap up at the tail end, talking a little bit about where the Microsoft Copilot ecosystem is going in regards to security. Most particularly, they have Purview AI Hub, which is in preview right now. And that tying together not just Copilot security and governance management, right? But across also a lot of third-party platforms and solutions. And then just a quick tidbit, especially because I was talking a little bit about this earlier on LinkedIn, Apple Intelligence. That's being released early next week, right? Or it's going to be hitting everyone who has a Apple iOS device hitting their phones, right? And what firms should be thinking about in regards to that, and how to create maybe in-tune restrictions and all that kind of stuff, from a good compliance standpoint. So that being said, I think Shane, what we can do here is we're gonna have you go through just a little bit like what is Copilot? How does it get leveraged? What are kind of like some of the data boundaries and all that kind of stuff? So folks are foundationally kind of like up to speed, right? We'll share a couple of the screens that we have and whatnot, and as we do that, then we'll be able to kind of start to deep dive into like those living off the land attacks and how threat actors are leveraging them. Before we do that, obviously, there's a lot of folks who've already been leveraging essentially, generative AI agents and large language models now for, anywhere from 12 to 18 months, right? It's not a new topic at this point. It's a pretty dead horse that everyone kind of beats upon. But that being noted, firms, they, leverage generative AI agents within the enterprise to help summarize data like emails and all that kind of stuff, and help do some level of copywriting of content or information. Super helpful, super awesome. But at the same time too, maybe firms not being as aware of some of the types of data, right, that those generative AI agents have access to. And because Microsoft Copilot is just kind of like ingrained into the rest of the Microsoft 365 ecosystem by default, right, it has access to a lot of information. So that being said, Shane, why don't you walk us through a little bit about that, like architecture around Copilot and those data boundaries and whatnot?
Absolutely. Yeah. So obviously, Copilot is built off of a model that's very similar to what people are also familiar with, which is OpenAI's ChatGPT 4.0. With that in mind, what Microsoft has done is they've packaged it with a lot of other components that make it suitable for not just a enterprise environment, but a business in general. Makes it more useful contextually, but at the same time, the usefulness comes with a bunch of risks. So what Microsoft has done here is it goes through a number of different stages to essentially ensure that we are providing, or rather it provides, not just the most relevant data based on how you have configured it, based on your licensing and dictated configuration and access, but also what your compliance policies are and what regulations you're trying to follow.
So what you're telling me is here, and the point of obviously, our conversation and presentation tonight is, it's not a great idea for people to just purchase those Copilot licenses, assign them to users, and then just start going about it, right? That we should be a little bit more methodical with that approach, right?
I would always recommend you be methodical, but in this case, it's especially important.
Yeah.
So, as you can see here, that they've got a lot of back and forth here. Just to kind of simplify what this whole chart means. Number one, we've got our user making their prompt, comes into the Copilot interface. this step here we see yet number 2, grounding. What grounding effectively is, long story short, it's a way for it to contextualize what the user is trying to do based on details Copilot has about that user and about the ecosystem that the user operates in and the organization that is being licensed in. With that in mind, it can then update the prompt so that the model is able to effectively generate a more tailored response for what they're looking for. As it comes back, it then passes through your purview and compliance components. And this is really important. It's separate from the other boundaries that are being set at the grounding stage, or even right at the entry point of the LLM. So it's very important, for example, that you have your appropriate labeling and things in place, and your appropriate retention and whatnot, because this is the stage where it happens, right before it gets sent back to the user. Now, there's a lot of back and forth that goes on there. This all happens actually rather quickly, but one of the things to keep in mind here, you see how he keeps pointing to, a bunch of these arrows go to Microsoft Graph, which connects with the Dataverse aspect of your environment, which everybody has, whether or not they believe. If you have a Microsoft organization, you have a Dataverse component. Maybe you haven't stumbled on it yet. These two aspects in the context of your organization have potentially tremendous access to details about every user, everything that is shared, and contextual data around every aspect of every piece of information that moves in and out of the system. And therefore, theoretically, depending upon what version of Copilot you're using, and again, how you've configured your system, users could potentially be putting themselves in circumstances where data is potentially being leaked, or users are potentially training the model on what's considered to be private information.
That's a really good point that you make there. So, we work with a lot of folks, across a lot of different industries, but one of the particular industries that's like really sensitive from a regulatory space, is the alternative investment space, right? Because, the SEC, within the United States is very particular about, having transparency and disclosures and all that kind of stuff, right? That's why people, they have to retain emails for a significant period of time. And if they're leveraging, text messaging or anything like that for business purposes, they have to retain that as well, right? So when we talk about like user interactions, right, and what somebody is asking a generative AI agent and the response that they get back, right, that compliance aspect's important from a data retention.
It's subjective to this,
Yeah. And then also to your point, right, is Microsoft like training off of this data?
Yeah.
Now, frequent question I get, good sir, is what's the difference between, Copilot, Copilot Pro, and Microsoft Copilot? In a nutshell, can you give folks just a little bit of that information?
Super simple, okay?
Yeah.
Or rather, I'm going to keep it super simple. Behind the scenes is not simple at all, as are most things. But on the surface, vanilla Copilot. Vanilla Copilot is your generalized AI assistant capacity in the Microsoft applications. The settings are usually individualized within those applications themselves. They could theoretically have some kind of configuration pushed down by the organization, but typically this is a very unbounded, not very well restricted sort of Copilot experience. It also means that theoretically there are certain types of user inputs that could be subject to being retained for training purposes, and certain pieces of information could be extracted that could be considered private, that might be used for contextualizing it during that grounding phase that you don't want to be used. So it's important to know that Copilot, this is your Fisher Price entry level sort of Copilot. Works pretty well, but it comes with some consequences if it is not really reined in, and reining it in across an organization can be very difficult. Copilot Pro, a little bit more business data and analysis. It has some built-in regulatory functionality sort of out of the box. But with that said, it is essentially a middle step, of course, between your Copilot and your Microsoft Copilot 365. So it doesn't have strong adherence to compliances, but it does have a handful of boundaries that are preset for things. I believe GDPR I want to say HIPAA. I think there's some for some of the ISO stuff.
So
You want
it's like prosumer, really, really
correct,
small business
correct,
that's not regulated. But if you're
E-
regulated and all that kind of stuff,
exactly.
just go to the Microsoft 365 Copilot, right?
Correct. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. Copilot's more Ryobi. Copilot Pro, this is your Milwaukee, right? And then your Microsoft 365 Copilot. This is your Bosch Premium, right? This is your we're paying $1,000 for a jigsaw from Bosch Premium, right? This is
Good
the thing that
analogies
you
there,
use
good
for
sir.
forever. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Not only is this built around purview and compliance at the core, but it gives you extensive configurability for what Copilot will contextually have access to within your ecosystem
Yeah.
holistically, and give you the permeability to be able to selectively retain aspects of things whilst ensuring that there is no selective training or selective retention outside of what you explicitly dictate. Unless you dictate that it's okay, it doesn't happen.
So concisely put, Microsoft 365 Copilot, obviously we're going to have a lot of our conversation focused on that today, right? Securing, your
Just
ecosystem. Yeah. But in a nutshell, Microsoft 365 Copilot essentially complies with the existing data governance and compliance requirements of the rest of the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. And they're not training off any of the data, so you don't have to worry about that, right? So it's your data,
correct.
your ecosystem, your compliance controls with Microsoft 365 Copilot, right?
Yeah, it's essentially opt out for all training and retention until you selectively opt into pieces purposefully for compliance purposes, or for allowing users certain types of context under certain circumstances that you might want them to have access to that you would otherwise be filtered out in that initial submission during grounding.
I see. Okay. And you were talking about that quote unquote kind of like dataverse and whatnot around your organization. So, in this illustration here, we have like that semantic, index, right? And that gets created by the organization that you're in, what you have access to and whatnot. And then it's not on just like one thing, right? It's across a lot of the different applications and all that kind of stuff, right?
Correct. Correct. Think of it like Windows search, except it's for your entire Microsoft ecosystem and it works.
Okay, I love that. Now, so one of the questions that I very frequently get from people is, okay, with all this context and Microsoft 365 Copilot, I bought a license and whatnot. Why isn't it secure just like out of the box? Why isn't it just already configured for me? Right? We're gonna get into some of the nuances, but some of those kind of like scenarios when it comes to like living off the land attacks and malicious actors doing like prompt injection. Would you be able to talk about a couple of those different scenarios of what malicious actors are actually doing, what's been kind of seen through, different red teaming security conferences and talks and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So just like most generative AI models, which are large language models, it's subjectively vulnerable to a lot of the same types of attacks that you'd see ChatGPT subject to, or any other
Yeah.
party model, where there isn't explicit boundaries or indices that are set up to detect conditions or prevent conditions. Some type of attacks, could be data exfiltration, or a type of prompt injection where you're prefacing the agent so that it will include certain bits of information that it otherwise might not include, that may either be right at the boundary, or maybe it's partially over the boundary, but because the majority of the request is still within scope, it's scored low enough that it still answers, even if it is producing a response that would otherwise would be unintended by the administrator of the AI system. This is a pretty good example right here. Essentially, you're prefacing the AI to include information that would otherwise not normally be included. Now, if you were to step over the boundary a little bit further than this, I suspect that during that grounding phase, some of the default rules would probably restrict it by default. However, clever wording, just like in other AI models, can allow you to step further and further and further over that boundary circumstantially. And as a result of that, it's very important to, again, catch some of these things in later phases, like with the purview and compliance components.
I see. I was about to say, so in a lot of instances, I've been talking to folks where they'll get compromised by a malicious actor. So we'll have an account takeover attack of a particular user, and the malicious actor will actually leverage Copilot to quickly start to exfiltrate data, right? So
Yes.
please search, all my emails, for the term password, return back the results for me, that type of stuff, right? And I've even seen some instances where folks have gotten kind of intuitive with these, living off the land attacks where they'll actually ask Copilot, they'll say, they're playing a game, and hey, can you please encode that in base64 as a response, right? The hope being that they bypass some of the default mechanisms for detecting data exfiltration and prompt injection and whatnot, right?
So something else I have heard of happening. I haven't witnessed it, and I haven't actually tried it myself. But some of the things that people also might not realize is that Copilot is buried in the bowels of all of the Microsoft applications at this point. That means that it is very deeply integrated in ways that you might or might not even realize it is. One of those is being able to accept invites in Teams.
Yeah.
Now, you might think to yourself, well, that's not such a big risk. However, theoretically, if an attacker were able to, again, do this kind of thing, they could theoretically bring in outside remote code execution scenarios using your typical, here's a meeting invite situation, having Copilot accept meetings on your behalf.
So good note there. So I have seen what's really, really interesting is, and here I'll briefly just kind of take this off screen. But what I have seen that's really, really interesting is malicious actors. What they'll do is they'll, they realize email phishing and all that kind of stuff, is less successful because everyone, now has, an email security scanner and all that fun jazz, right? And so they'll reach out to people directly on Microsoft Teams because, organization by default has Microsoft Teams external communications turned on,
Correct.
right? So they send a message, it'll pop up and it'll say a little message like, hey, are you going to accept this message? Hey, make sure it's not malicious. But most people, they read through it real quick, they hit accept, right? And so now you think that you're talking to, maybe someone else within the organization, right? Who's with your, I don't know, IT department or something like that, right? And what I've seen is that if you impersonate someone else's name that's within the organization, right? You use Teams Fisher and all that kind of stuff. You reach out to a user, right? What you can then in that interaction, the Copilot agent, if you ask it to summarize today's communications and chats and whatnot, it'll say, oh yeah, and you were talking to this person in the internal IT department. Because it doesn't know the difference.
It can't
differentiate the names, that kind of stuff. Yeah, and so it doesn't actually say this was John Smith external, right?
Correct.
Like,
the externals
talking to John
excluded.
Smith. Yeah.
Yep. I've also seen situations. I've actually witnessed situations where it's possible where Copilot doesn't actually evaluate code on a page, but it is possible to get Copilot to follow instructions and follow a chain of pages if it is asked to review the content of a remote URL, and it has not been explicitly forbidden to not do this.
So, actually, you bring that up, right? So, interestingly enough, our last Cyber Judo session, we were talking about indirect prompt injection attacks, right? And so this is that scenario. We're looking at the Edge browser right now. Is that right?
It does look like Edge to me.
Yeah. So we're in the Edge browser right now, right? And we can see that we have essentially, a website, right, that has been provided, these malicious injected commands, right? And that Copilot is then picking it up, right, and responding to that as if it was actually coming from the user, right? So it's like a classic prompt injection attack.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It absolutely is. And what's even more interesting is that you can use this not just for purposes of going and leading a user down a dark alleyway where they make a bunch of bad decisions. You can use this to help manipulate users into intentionally including vulnerabilities in their code that you can exploit later on down the line. And
Yeah.
this is becoming extremely common, unfortunately.
So, in the cybersecurity space, we have a term, RCE, right? Remote code execution, right? And, now that there's been the term, coined RCE, but mostly referring to Copilot in regards to remote Copilot execution attacks. Do you want to talk a little bit about that in regards to like what a remote code, or I'm sorry, what a remote Copilot execution attack is?
I mean, so there are situations where, again, you can have Copilot execute certain functions on your behalf. So
Yeah.
circumstantially, again, if it received the necessary preface to be able to go and behave in a way that the user did not intend at all, this is obeyed fairly in a fair degree of compliance, especially with clever wording. Obviously, attackers don't
Yeah.
generally go and distribute prompts that don't work well.
So, kind of thinking about all these aspects. So, we have the practical, attack surface risks, right, of having a Copilot environment where we're not leveraging something like Microsoft Purview communications compliance and insider threat management, right? That, is looking at those prompts, right? But then also at the same time, we have, the data retention, right? Making sure that the prompts and the interactions between users is being retained for a certain period of time so we can go back and review it, especially because three, we want to make sure that there's accuracy in that data, right? To kind of back up the, aspect of like being transparent, right? So, thinking about that deployment process, right? I know that, by default, when someone gets the Microsoft 365 Copilot license, this is kind of the part that's not so awesome. You don't get the rest of the Microsoft Purview, compliance ecosystem, right? You have to have the appropriate licensing for it, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about like what types of licensing are necessary for someone who's getting ready to kind of securely deploy Microsoft 365 Copilot?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so honestly, the way to do this is either your center option here, or your core or best in class. Honestly, so if you're going with an E3, you do have to get that additional add-on to be able to facilitate the necessary compliance functionality, to be able to ensure that you have the necessary control over that information, retention wise, data labeling wise, as well as being able to appropriately access the context that you want to use to be able to access, right, without it being essentially completely confined to the default, which is opt out. Again, if you're going with 365 Microsoft Copilot 365, a lot of these aspects are opt out until you opt in. So you need that configurability, and users will need that functionality available to them. If you go up to an E5, I don't know that you necessarily require the SharePoint Advanced Management at that point. However, it's best. It's something that you should have, because I do believe it gives you better control over the individual individual sensitivity labels. The other thing that's nice about doing it with an E5 is you have the automatic application, you have the automatic sensitivity labels, which is a huge thing. I mean, if you're going to do and curate that manually, that's going to be a pretty big headache.
So a pro tip that I've been providing folks, and by the way, I learned this the hard way in a couple of my deployments, right? So the SharePoint Advanced Management is really, really good for producing those reports. Like in the initial planning phase, you want to secure the ecosystem, the environment of like, okay, are people in the appropriate, Entra ID and Azure AD access groups, OneDrive and SharePoint sites and all that kind of stuff. And you could script that. You can do that. You could generate a couple high-level reports out of the box, but the SharePoint Advanced Management, that gives you some really, really detailed reporting, right, that you can then kind of like start to drill down to. And I think we got a quick illustration of that, actually, that you uploaded here. Yeah, right here. Yes. So what that allows us to do with the, the the SharePoint Advanced Management is generate very specific reports on the file sharing, who has access, what type of data is in there, and then you can get that, kind of Excel breakdown.
Yeah, there you go.
That's why they
Yeah,
suggest it.
yeah.
Previously,
It makes
and
it
it
so much easier.
yeah.
One of the things that a lot of people don't think about is that when before you go gung ho about deploying this, you need to have a clean house first,
Yeah.
right? You need to make sure you're in a good place compliance wise, that your purview is configured right, that your data label, or rather your sensitivity labels, are in a good place. You need to make sure that you've maybe not perfectly curated your access within Office 365 with respect to like OneDrive and SharePoint, but that it's also not a dumpster fire. If you've got a heap of tires to deal with, you're only going to make your problem a lot worse here. You should try to trim that down before you take a bite out of this.
It's a good
But
point. Yeah.
if you just again to sort of just preface getting this done securely, if you have yourself in good order before you do this, you're still going to have more to do. That doesn't mean that you're automatically done, because there's additional there's additional labels you end up needing to apply. There's additional policies you have to apply, but it makes the project, if you will, because this essentially becomes a project for most people,
Yeah.
much more manageable, and much more approachable. Because again, you can kind of see from that screenshot there, this kind of stuff can get out of hand quickly if you have a very substantial SharePoint footprint, or if you have a very substantial OneDrive footprint. And a lot of times organizations have a mix of both, and it's just madness.
So that's a really good note. So basically, in a nutshell, right? So if organizations, if they're an E3 shop, right, they should probably look at getting. I think there's an E5 information governance add-on, right, or be an E5 shop. But no matter the case, like as you're kind of planning out your deployment process and you're doing your access review, at least temporarily leveraging that SharePoint Advanced Management
Oh,
license to make your life a little bit easier.
absolutely, yeah.
Cool.
And not every user needs to have that, right? Whoever's doing the work needs to have that.
I see. And one of the things I want to kind of briefly call out for folks that are watching this either now or in the future is that, this is like a rapidly evolving ecosystem right now. Microsoft was very, very primitive with their initial kind of like release of like the administrative controls around Copilot, right? And particularly in the last 6 months, they've really been ramping up things, and obviously we're going to talk about at the end AI Hub and whatnot. But it looks like a lot of this, Shane, is kind of like intersecting with Purview DLP now. Previously, it wasn't.
Previously, it was very separate. Now they're trying to unify the experience, and that's why you have that's partially why it feels like the Purview components of this come after the LLM has its fully contextualized response. But it's also partially to ensure that the LLM does not leak information that is not compliant with your rules. It definitely is something that came in later than the initial Copilot, later into the Copilot architecture, if you will.
I was about to say, so when kind of like doing the deployment process, and again, their documentations, Microsoft's documentation is ever growing or in a state of flux and change because they're updating so much. But previously, there was no ability to leverage leverage detecting Copilot interactions, so within the web browser very well. But now they have the Insider Risk Management Browser signal detection plugin, right? That you can then install onto Edge and that kind of stuff, and that follows the same policies
Correct.
that you're kind of deploying for Copilot, right?
Correct. Yeah. The compliance management plugin works in any Chromium-based browser. So it works in Chrome, it works in Edge. If you're crazy and you're using Opera, it will technically work there. And it essentially allows you to detect those conditions where there are interactions that would otherwise fall outside of the ecosystem.
Cool. So it's essentially like we have, step one, review all your access for your users across, Entra ID, Azure AD, across, OneDrive and SharePoint. once you've done that, right, then we're starting to set up like, our data labels, right, and auto classifiers. And Microsoft has some of those kind of like built into Purview by default, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. And if you can leverage those, I would absolutely recommend it because again, going in and creating labels and classifications manually is
Mhm.
a tribulation that no one deserves to be put through.
So for folks who maybe are a little bit less tech savvy, they're a little bit less familiar with Microsoft Purview. Can you just briefly kind of highlight like what is a data label? What's the purpose of it? How does let's say Purview detect automatically a piece of information like in an email if it's like financial information or it's a social security number? Like how that kind of all works?
Yeah. So essentially, you have two parameters here. So one is a way to categorize findings into sets, where they have to be handled a certain way, and the others are the way that you detect them. Essentially, it's a condition, whether it be a regular expression or looking for a sequence that is not necessarily an explicit sort of regular expression, like semantic of being able to identify a name, or the semantic of being able to identify a birthday, which might not be detected by a regular expression, but can be detected by some of the models that they use to search for this information.
I say. And like things like social security numbers or ABA routing and bank account numbers, like those are
Yes,
things that like
those are
syntactically are
usually
consistent.
straight on. Exactly, those are usually straight on like regular expressions. However, up until recently, it might have not been. It is possible now, by the way. So in the past, a social security number could be hidden by just obscuring it by adding some other symbol other than dots or dashes or spaces between the numbers. It's the sequence of numbers and their grouping that allowed for it to be detected very easily. Now, with some of the semantics that they're using, leveraging again using large language models, it's possible to actually detect things like social security numbers that are written out in text, like 1 1 1.
Really
Oh yeah,
intuitive, very
it's
intuitive.
and it's a smart thing to do, because you would not believe how often those types of things end up being in formats that are either mistakenly outside of what the old expressions would be able to identify, or they're intentionally done that way to hide them because people want to be able to exchange information over mediums they're not supposed to be.
I see. So, when we then start to kind of configure Copilot with those data sensitivity labels and with also the Purview Communication Compliance Center, like alerts, right? That's where we're able to have situations where, like, there's this type of attack where someone's asking for like social security numbers, right? And it's like, sorry, can't chat about this, right? And then on the back end, right, for, like our technology engineers or cybersecurity engineers, they're able to more specifically, see, okay, there was this interaction, right, that was sent from this person, right? This was the recipient, right? And here was the request, here was the response, and then being able to like create an alert off of that so that someone's kind of from an insider risk management perspective, like, okay, there's a staff member who's asking about a lot of questionable things.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's definitely nice to be able to see that kind of information, because again, historically this type of data was not available, and I don't believe this level of accessibility is going to be available, or rather, this level of interaction of visibility is not going to be available in anything other than the 365 Copilot. I'm almost certain this is not available in Copilot or Copilot Pro, even if
Yeah.
with configuration. So
Oh
this is
yeah.
going to be an explicit sort of premium feature that you would be creating alerts off of, again, just like you would have alerts set up with, Sentinel. If you have certain types of interactions that occur, a user tried to user tried to bypass Smart Screen, or a user went ahead and downloaded an executable for something from a site that's considered not appropriate, or any of those types of things, that you get a notification about it, you do exactly the same thing here.
Yeah. I was about to say, yeah, this is exactly where Purview Communications Compliance and Insider Risk Management really kind of steps in to do the heavy lifting, right? And being
Exactly.
able to detect that prompt being malicious, right? And then us being able to create specific rules to alert on or just specifically block certain types of requests, right? And this is then where we kind of chain it to, you know, um, we have the data labels. So, we label every document automatically in email and SharePoint and all that kind of stuff with a social security number is
Mhm.
confidential and Copilot do not respond, right, to any type of requests, right? They're interfacing with confidential documents, right? Ergo, it should then stop at that point, right? At that data boundary that's been defined, that
Correct.
action that's been defined.
Yeah,
This is a
you can not only explicitly have it not perform responses against certain types of labels, but it's possible to go ahead and also indicate that there are certain types of phrases that are to be avoided as well, and a lot of those are baked in. So those are going to be available across the board. If you were to start asking about social security numbers, even in vanilla Copilot, you're going to get blocked pretty rapidly right off the bat. But this is to be able to essentially bar Copilot from digging into the contents of pieces of material that have been labeled in a certain way.
So to my kind of earlier example about talking about more heavily regulated firms, right? So firms in the alternative investment space, that have to be considerate of SEC requirements. And actually, to the brief tangent, the SEC just released their divisions of examinations
Mm.
exam priorities for 2025, explicitly calling out AI and making sure that organizations use generative AI, right, in a way that's secure and consistent and transparent and auditable, right? And
Right.
so this is where, folks can really then, dig in, see what type of prompts are being requested by users, right? Being able to see what the responses were, right? And then being able to have that retained for some
I was going
period
to
of
say it gives
time
you
where we
that
can search.
e-discovery aspect that you're going to need theoretically if something comes into question.
Yeah. So that being said, the ecosystem and where it's going, it seems to be that it's continuously starting to kind of edge a little bit closer to Purview AI Hub, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But are there any other big kind of deployment considerations? So we have the understand the data in your environment, lock down the access, set up the data labels, set up now your Purview compliance center communication rules and insider threat management rules and alerts, right? Are thinking about that data boundary. Um, what else would we want to do to kind of like help protect the organization?
Well, I don't. It doesn't occur to me if we mentioned ensuring that you have appropriate retention parameters set up as well.
Oh
Again,
yeah,
it's going to be
yeah.
market specific, or industry specific rather. Of course, that's something you're going to want to do, and that's just compliance in general. But for setting individual boundaries, you know, it it depends upon exactly what you're trying to do. But with that said, I with Microsoft Copilot 365. Again, a lot of things are opt out by default. So your boundaries are going to be the strictest they are out of the box. It's going to be more of you either adding specificity for aspects which are outside of the normal purview of the Microsoft ecosystem, not necessarily things outside of Microsoft, but like documents of this classification or this
Mhm.
particular set of phrases. But then also enabling the ability for users to perform certain types of functions which would otherwise be restricted. So
Yeah.
essentially opening pinholes in those boundaries.
So I've had a couple folks like ask me. So there is the one thing that is kind of open by default. It's the web content search, right? So that's
Yeah.
it. That's enabled. And I've had some folks ask like, "Hey, the web content search, right? when Copilot goes to read out, right, is that all secure? And I kind of had to break it down with them of like, well, if that starts to get out of your Microsoft 365 ecosystem, right, that's actually making a search query somewhere else, right? And
Right.
so for organizations that maybe want to be, really, really deliberate with restricting the use of Copilot to company specific functions and tasks and whatnot, and the heavy focus on the web content access and potentially disabling that, right? And then also like any of your other kind of third party plugins,
I was going to say, yeah, that it does occur to me that one of the things you're definitely going to want to do is prevent users from being able to enable and administer their own plugins unless they have been vetted by somebody in advance, because who knows what they could contain. It's just like a user installing a browser plugin. It could be completely legitimate, or it could be exfiltrating data. It could be performing functions that you otherwise don't want it to be doing. So certainly that's probably both of those are going to be things you're going to want to consider in advance as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And making sure like users can't like approve their own plugins and whatnot. So it's like applying that principle of like just enough access.
Just enough. Yeah. Users should never be able to install their own, enable or approve their own plugins. They shouldn't be able to do that in the browser either, in my opinion. But it's just like it's just as important as ensuring that users aren't able to go and authorize their own third-party applications to access Microsoft 365 in general. You wouldn't want to do that. That would, that makes sense to most people. This is exactly the same sort of scenario.
So,
they potentially have more access.
I've now encountered a lot of situations where folks are looking to leverage other generative AI solutions beyond Copilot, that are still a Microsoft shop, right? So they might be using like a specific piece of software. And, that has been kind of a little bit of a pain point and sticking point for a while. And I know this is now just kind of like in preview here, but the Microsoft Purview, AI Hub. And starting to your point, like iteratively tie everything together, right? And tying together not just Copilot compliance, governance, and security rules and controls and auditing, right? But also for other third-party, solutions and all that kind of stuff, right? So really being able to kind of dig in and see, okay, these are this based on various prompts from users, right? This is what the associated severity or insider severity risk is, right? For, users that are leveraging Copilot right now or leveraging ChatGPT or some other solution, right? So that things are consistent, right? From an organization, data governance, compliance perspective, right?
Right.
And being able to kind of see that like all in one place, all the AI interactions, right? So, like at this juncture, I think like everyone pretty much has like an API for this. And at least in my understanding, they've gotten pretty well kind of well-featured ecosystem of supported sites. It's like something like, I mean, I didn't count it, but it's certainly greater than 50, right? It seems to be almost like an endless amount of sites, obviously including your typical stuff like, Google Bard and ChatGPT and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, this is really, really exciting. I don't really have a ton of context in regards to actually specifically deploying out AI Hub because it's still
I love that AI Dungeons on there for some reason.
Yeah, I know. It's those users, they really enjoy, their interactive video games. AI Dungeon. Last I knew, I think it's it's like text based too.
It is text based. So I immediately when I see things like AI Dungeon, and the Adventure AI.gg on there, I'm picturing the first page of the AI Hub where it's breaking down the interactions. The inappropriate interactions would be like 99% of that of the pie chart.
So that all being noted, so when we think about what we need to do to kind of securely deploy and roll out, Copilot from a high level perspective, it's okay. first we want to make sure that we have the appropriate licensing in place. Are we an E3 shop, or are we a small business premium shop? Are we an E5 shop for an not an E5 shop getting the, E5 add-ons for the information governance risk management and insider risk management as you kind of see fit, right? Then there is on top of that, okay, now we're looking at the data boundaries of we're looking at the data boundaries of our existing ecosystems, the access that users have, the OneDrive groups, the SharePoint sites, auditing that, making sure people are put into the right groups, right? Then we start to build out our data labels and our automatic classifiers, have those get applied. Now, every step of the way, what we're doing is we're applying this to a pilot group of users. We don't want to just deploy this at scale to everyone, right?
Correct.
And then as that we continue, right, locking down the plugin access, locking down the access for web content, if that's kind of something you see fit, right? And making sure that the appropriate settings and alerts are set up for like insider risk management prompts, right? That hit a certain level where it's like, okay, this is obviously malicious. Make sure it's going to the right team. What did any big items that got missed there, Shane?
It does occur to me that one of the things that a lot of times people don't think about is, again, that Dataverse component, or the Microsoft Power environment.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Power Apps and so on. These are areas that are often forgotten about when it comes to checking for access control, and ensuring that labeling is occurring appropriately. So just keep those things in mind too if you are using them, because they will be included somewhat automatically by Copilot, unless they are exclusively, or rather not excluded, intentionally excluded in the configuration. And I don't believe they are by default. I believe pretty much everything is included in that scope.
We had a really great question come in. Great discussion. What's your familiarization with the data redaction and removal of sensitive data from Copilot? Oh, that's a really good one. So that would be mostly handled through the Microsoft Peer Review DLP settings, right? And the making sure that you have the data sensitivity labels set up correctly. That being said, and Shane, correct me if I'm wrong here, I have not yet seen where there is specifically the ability to redact, to respond to a prompt with all the information, all the data, right? And or what was intended in the data, right? But then redact, let's say, I don't know, usernames or first name, last name, or something like that, right? In real time. But
Yeah,
I could be incorrect there.
I haven't witnessed that, and I'm not aware of that feature. What I have, what Copilot will tend to do is, if it's not being blocked by one of the policies that forbid it from looking at a document to be able to perform to build the response, or forbid it to that type of data in general, or that it contains forbidden words like SSN. If it hits one of those things, it's usually just going to say that it can't respond to that prompt, rather than redacting individual pieces of it to best answer without giving them information. That said, that would be a really cool feature if Microsoft came out with it.
So
I'm not aware of it.
So, again, good question. I don't know if I would, say that I had the perfect answer for this one. But if I was going to probably approach such a situation, I know that Microsoft, they just started creating these prompt shields, right? And the prompt shields are for Azure OpenAI. Now, Microsoft 365 Copilot is just Azure OpenAI, right? Tacked on with nice UI, a little bit of better interface, and all that kind of stuff, right?
One important difference that they do actually run their own model internally, though. So OpenAI doesn't train off that data.
So I would think that one of the things that maybe someone would have to do, Shane, in that particular circumstance would be to have a Microsoft Graph API, right? Go to their own Azure OpenAI instance with the prompt shields on. The prompt shields, I do believe, again, those are in preview, right? But I believe do redaction, right? Because they were specifically created for, nuanced jailbreaking
Yeah,
and
they're made
prompt
for
injection
chatbot
attacks.
situations. Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
That might be a good way to do it. That would
so
be an interesting experiment to try.
another good question that I got come in, and from this one's off of YouTube here. So what's Copilot Studio, and how's that different than Microsoft 365 Copilot? Shane, do you want to tackle that one? Good, sir.
I haven't really worked with Copilot Studio too much yet, but it essentially allows you to significantly customize your Copilot experience. And, so I think that's something that we'd want to cover more in depth another episode here. But and maybe we can even go through some of the demonstrate certain aspects of it. But in a simple sort of way, it's a way for you to significantly customize the experience beyond just setting up policies that set up arbitrary or policy-based constraints.
So I've worked with a couple situations of helping folks dabble with Copilot Studio because they're looking to create AI agents that had a specific function,
Yeah.
usually like helping them with some type of statistical thing, right? And so what the Copilot Studio allows folks to do is in a nutshell, you're creating your own unique, specific generative AI agents, right? That can be published, right, within the organization. You're going to publish them externally. If you go to do that, it's very, very, you have to be really considerate of that. But that also has its own set of security and compliance rules and governance rules and whatnot. So, yeah, fair point there, good sir, in regards to that is a really good topic for a future session.
There's a lot to discuss there. It's very much like the models that they have in the marketplace on OpenAI now, where you essentially set the user context and you could supply some amount of data to help refine the engine around a certain concept or certain ideals. And again, it's what you're saying is it's for purposeful design of individual agents, and that's exactly what it is. It's so you can tune an agent who knows how to talk about how to figure out, do you need a new tire or not, and then connect you with the right people if appropriate, versus one that can maybe help you troubleshoot certain things, or one that is helping you process data for financial purposes. Copilot itself is more generalized than that most of the time.
So, we focused a lot talking about, Copilot, right? But there's obviously a lot of generative AI solutions, and folks should be kind of aware of, right? There's been this massive adoption on the consumer side, right? Both on Android and iOS and all that. A lot of the firms, that I've had the opportunity of collaborating with, again, highly regulated organizations, large user base of Apple iOS users, right? And I haven't seen this kind of discussed a lot, but I've had a couple of like CTOs, bring this up to me, which is Apple Intelligence. So, Apple Intelligence, this is basically Apple's looking to get this pushed out. I think it's Monday of next week, right? I think it's like October 28th. And Apple Intelligence is essentially Apple's own generative AI large language model solution, right? That's basically just using ChatGPT in the background with a little bit of extra sauce, right? But it will allow folks to do things like some level of summarizing information, like emails, right? And copywriting information for folks, right? And helping write things and all that kind of stuff. And so I had a couple of CTOs. They asked me. They said, "Hey, what am I going to actually do about this? Like, how can I restrict my users from leveraging this, right? Like, I don't know a lot about it right now. I'm a bit concerned. I want people to be using the company approved solutions, right? I understand that, my users are going to find Apple Intelligence to be convenient, but it's not in our own data governance ecosystem and compliance ecosystem. I can't track for it. I can't retain the prompts for all that information, what questions are being asked, what information people get back. I'm afraid about that becoming customary within the business. So luckily, Microsoft and Apple have collaborated quite a bit. And so with Intune MDM as well as MAM, right, folks can now define restriction policies, what a user can actually do on an iOS device, right? When it comes to leveraging, the various functions of Apple Intelligence, right? Now, obviously, this is a conjunction with other, Intune configurations that you might already have on a device. Like, for example, not allowing users to copy and paste information between your company managed applications, right? Like Outlook, right? And unmanaged applications like the Notes app and that kind of stuff, right? So, definitely for any folks that are on the, in an IT department or they're in the IT managed services space and whatnot, this is really, really important to kind of be privy of. If you haven't already started to kind of think about what type of Intune profiles you want to deploy to your user base or your customer base, depending if they're MDM or MAM, right? They'll be a little bit different in regards to what features and functionality you completely get, right? But again, this is something for folks to just be quite aware of on the horizon, right, as it starts to hit everyone's iOS devices. So to that, it looks like we have covered a lot of good topics here.
Out of curiosity, Christian, are you aware of any anything coming for Intune that can help manage Gemini on Android devices?
Yes. I'm
not aware of it.
So, okay. So, I'm not going to do my research on Gemini, right? But what I do know
That's why I asked, because I don't use Gemini.
Yeah, the same data restriction controls for being able to disable copy and paste, right? Being able to disable data sharing between managed and unmanaged applications, and what the inputs are into the applications. That's for the most part feature consistent between Android, right, and iOS. But I'll be honest, the reason why I'm a little bit less privy to Gemini and Bard and whatnot is because usually the more heavily regulated organizations and firms, that kind of stuff, have moved from a G Suite type of environment, more focusing on Microsoft 365 because that's the thing that organizations use. You know what I mean? Yeah. But you make a fair point there. Again, I think that's another great topic for us to cover, especially because this has been so heavily Microsoft focused, right? That talking about actually the Google Workspace, right, approach, right, and how to do all this with Gemini and Bard and Android devices, I think it's a really, really another good topic. And
that's what I was just thinking. It would be good to look into that a little bit.
Yeah, layers on, so for and any folks who haven't seen our previous session on generative AI, so we originally were talking about how malicious actors leverage generative AI agents in particular, like chatbots and all that kind of stuff on people's websites, and with prompt injection attacks and jailbreaking attacks to get access to confidential information, do remote code execution, how to kind of do some threat modeling around those generative AI agents and large language models, and how to start to kind of do penetration testing and security testing on them and all that. So for anyone who hasn't seen that, definitely go check that out. It's on YouTube, it's on LinkedIn. There's a GitHub
questions repo. Or comments, post them and we'll answer them.
Yeah, there's a GitHub repo that we kind of posted as a follow-up to that. There'll be a GitHub repo that we post on this subject, like a very specific guide. It's kind of more methodically broken down, beyond our pontification here. And then moving on to talking about Copilot Studio and Gemini and Bard, I think would be great.
Agreed. I think that'll be cool.
To that, it looks like we're just about at time here. Thank you so much for everyone for joining. Shane, thank you so much again for co-hosting me with me.